Hey everyone, welcome back to the deep dive. We're diving into something a little different today, but I have a feeling you're gonna love this one, especially for you folks who are, all about learning and growing. Today we're gonna be looking at how to unlock your potential as an artist, especially in a world where everything is so connected.
Yeah, and by artist, we're not just talking about the traditional stuff like, painting or music. We're going to be going way beyond that, kind of busting those old dusty definitions wide open, really moving past that old industrial way of thinking, which, let's be honest, is kind of holding us back.
Totally. And our guide for this deep dive is Seth Godin's book, The Icarus Deception, How High Will You Fly? It's a book that really makes you stop and think about what it even means to be an artist in the first place. And more importantly, how living that artistic life, embracing that, can actually lead to a life that's, well, more impactful, more interesting, more, well, everything, really.
Right. And we're not going to get lost in a bunch of theory here. I mean, we're all about those actionable takeaways, things you can actually use right away to make a real difference.
Exactly. So our mission today is pretty straightforward. We're going to unpack Godin's take on what it means to be an artist, because for him, it's about so much more than just, having a paintbrush in your hand or singing a song. It's about being brave, being creative, and this is key, having a real drive to connect with other people, which in a world that's often, all about transactions and algorithms, well, that connection piece is more important than ever.
I completely agree. So first things first, let's just kind of clear the air, right?
Uh,
When you hear the word art, I bet you picture what? A painting in a museum, a concert hall?
yeah, a ballet dancer, a poet scribbling away in a coffee shop, the classic images.
Exactly. And those are definitely forms of art, no question.
Yeah.
But Godin, he flips the script. He says art isn't limited to those traditional categories, not even close. Instead, he defines art as what we do when we're truly alive in the moment. Think about it. When you're really in the zone, doing something that lights you up, it usually involves, well, a certain amount of courage.
Yeah.
Right? You're putting yourself out there. And it also involves a unique perspective, an insight that's, well, kind of yours and yours alone.
Right, you're bringing something new to the table. And then there's the creative spark, obviously. And you can't forget the boldness to actually share that creation with the world. And maybe, just maybe, to connect with someone else, to resonate with them in a way that surprises both of you.
And this is the really cool part, the democratizing part. Godin isn't saying that only certain people have this magic artistic gene. He actually says that everyone has the potential to be an artist. In fact, there's this great quote for the book where he says, "We don't need to be taught to make art, but sometimes we need permission to do so." And that really hits home, doesn't it? Like, where have we been told, maybe indirectly, that we're not allowed to be creative, that art isn't for us?
It's like we've internalized this message that creativity belongs to some elite group. But Godin's whole point is that we need to reclaim that inherent human drive to create.
And to really understand this idea of reclaiming our potential, Godin uses the classic myth of Icarus. We all know the story, right? Icarus and his dad Daedalus, they're trapped. So they need these wings out of feathers and wax to escape. And Icarus, well, he gets a little carried away. He flies too close to the sun, the wax melts, and down he goes. Classic tale, right?
Yeah, the old "don't get too big for your britches" warning. Don't aim too high or you'll crash and burn. But, and this is where it gets really interesting, Godin turns that whole interpretation on its head. He says that in today's world, the real danger isn't flying too high, it's staying grounded, flying too low.
It's like he's saying we're so afraid of failing spectacularly that we actually end up guaranteeing a much worse outcome. We settle for mediocrity.
We stay in our comfort zone even when it's not actually comfortable anymore, and it's not just about us, right? Godin argues that by playing it safe, by flying too low, we actually deprive the world of our unique gifts, of the contributions we could be making. In fact, he says, we're so obsessed about the risk of shining brightly that we've traded in everything that matters to avoid it. And that makes you really stop and think about all the amazing things that never get created because we're too afraid to try.
Right. And all of this goes back to how we see our safety zone versus our comfort zone. For a long time, those two things were basically the same.
Yeah, your safety zone was all about predictability, right?
Yeah.
No surprises, no big risks, just kind of coasting along. Godin uses the example of a mountain climber, someone who instinctively knows when they're pushing beyond their limits. That feeling of discomfort, that's actually a signal to retreat, to stay safe.
Right. Like back in the day, that instinct helped us survive. It literally kept us alive. But the world, it's not like that anymore. The landscape has changed. And clinging to that old idea of safety, just doing what you've always done, Well, that's not so safe anymore.
In fact, Godin says that in this crazy, fast-paced world we live in, the real safety zone is actually art. He literally says art is the new safety zone, which at first sounds kind of crazy, right? But when you really think about it, it makes a lot of sense.
It does. He's saying that security, true security in this ever-changing world, comes from our ability to come up with new ideas, to be creative, and to connect with people who might be feeling isolated. And those two things, creating and connecting, that's the essence of what an artist does. In fact, he says, and I love this quote, creating ideas that spread and connecting the disconnected are the two pillars of our new society, and both of them require the posture of the artist.
So if I'm getting this right, you're saying that clinging to the old ways, trying to just fit in and keep things predictable, that's actually more risky than embracing your inner artist.
Exactly, because the world has undergone this huge shift, a seismic shift, really. We've moved from the industrial economy, which was all about factories and mass production, to what we now call the connection economy. And the values, the things that make you successful, they've changed completely.
Okay, so let's break that down. What were the core values of that old industrial economy we're leaving behind?
Well, think about a factory, right? It's all about efficiency. You have a system, you have rules, and everyone follows those rules to produce, millions of the same thing. It's about standardization, it's about compliance, it's about following instructions to a T. The goal was to create these perfectly identical widgets. Being a good worker meant being a reliable cog in that giant machine.
Gotcha. And now in this new connection economy, what are the things that really matter, the things that drive success?
In the connection economy, it's not enough to just produce a bunch of stuff. Value comes from information, valuable information, that is, and from relationships built on trust. And maybe most important of all, the ability to innovate, to come up with new ideas, to be creative. It's not that competence isn't important anymore, it's just that, it's not enough. Godin says that what the connection economy really craves, it craves things that are new, real, and important. And those three things, guess what? Those are the hallmarks of art.
New, real, and important. I like that. Can you give me a concrete example of how this shift plays out in the real world?
Sure, imagine this. In the industrial age, if your factory burned down, that was it, game over. You'd lose everything. But in the connection economy, if you've built strong relationships with your customers, if they trust you and value what you do, well, then even if you lose everything else, you can rebuild. You have that foundation of connection.
It's like losing your factory back then versus, I don't know, losing all your followers on social media today.
Yeah, exactly. And on the flip side, even if you have the most high-tech factory in the world, if you lose those connections, those relationships with your customers, well, you're sunk. Godin uses the example of Detroit. All those empty factories are a reminder that the game has changed. And at the heart of it all is the internet. He calls it a connection machine. And it's true. The internet has completely reshaped how we create, how we communicate, how we connect with each other.
So it's not about the physical stuff anymore, the factories and widgets. It's about the intangible stuff. Relationships, trust, ideas. Okay, so all this talk about everyone being an artist, I'm sure some people are listening to this and thinking, yeah, right, I'm no artist. What does Godin say to those skeptics?
He tackles that head on. He says, and I'm quoting him directly here, art is not for other people. Think about the people you admire, the ones who are making a real difference in the world, the ones who are actually changing things. They weren't born with some special artist label stamped on their foreheads. They weren't, pre-approved or anything. So don't tell yourself that you're just not the artistic type. That's just a cop-out.
What about that feeling of, discomfort, that squeamishness you might feel when you think about putting yourself out there creatively? It's scary, right?
Oh, totally. And Godin acknowledges that. He says that if you're trying to do something meaningful, to connect with people in a real way, to create something new, well, there's going to be some discomfort. You're going to feel vulnerable and you're going to take some risks. That's just part of the deal. But he calls this the pain of possibility. And he contrasts it with what he calls the pain of the cog, which is the pain of not living up to your potential, the pain of knowing you're capable of so much more but choosing to play it safe. And honestly, the pain of possibility, yeah, it's scary, but at least it means you're alive. You're moving forward. He quotes Joseph Campbell, who said that being an artist is all about the experience of being alive. And isn't that what we all want?
It really makes you think about how much that old industrial way of thinking is still with us. It's baked into our schools, our jobs, how we view success, everything.
Totally. The industrial age, it shaped everything. How we educate our kids, the whole 9-to-5 workday thing, our entire economy. It's everywhere. But Godin's point is that the industrial age is, well, it's fading. It's on its way out. And that's why there's so much anxiety and uncertainty in the world right now. People are like clinging to the old ways, but the old ways don't work anymore. He asked this really important question. Does our culture, our society, does it actually encourage us to dream big, to go beyond those cookie cutter solutions and actually create something new and different? And honestly, I think the answer is often no.
And wasn't the whole industrial system designed to make workers interchangeable, to eliminate the need for individual creativity and initiative?
Yeah, that was the whole point.
Okay.
You created a system that was so efficient, so automated, that it didn't matter who was doing the job. The system was more important than the individual, and we still see that today in so many ways. Think about applying for jobs online. It's all about algorithms and keywords. If you don't fit into their little boxes, you don't even get a second look.
It's like the system is designed to weed out anyone who's too unique or too different.
Exactly. And what about education? The original idea of a university was to create a space where the best minds could come together and share ideas to really push the boundaries of knowledge. But now it's more like a factory churning out graduates who are all, trained to think the same way, to fit into the system.
Godin calls them compliant workers.
Yeah, compliant workers ready to take their place in the machine. And they're all saddled with a mountain of debt.
It's crazy. But what I'm hearing from Godin is that the real opportunities, the really interesting stuff, it's not happening in the center. It's happening at the edges, in those places where people are willing to break the rules to try new things.
Right. In the industrial age, it was all about appealing to the masses, to the average person. Better safe than sorry, that was the motto. But now, the most successful people, the ones who are making a real impact, they're focusing on those weird edge cases. The people who are passionate, who are engaged, who are actually excited about something different. They're the ones who are driving innovation, who are spreading new ideas. The things that are truly remarkable, they're not safe, they're not predictable, they're definitely not boring. They're the things that make you sit up and take notice.
So in this new world, if we're not just cogs in a machine, what are the qualities that we should be focusing on building? What are the things that really matter now?
Godin highlights two key assets: humanity and remarkability. Successful organizations, they get that people crave connection. They're building trust. They're being more human in their interactions. And remarkable, that doesn't just mean good. It means something worth remarking upon. Something new, something different, something that takes a risk. In a world that's flooded with information, is what you're doing something people actually want to share, to talk about? Does it have that wow factor?
So it's not just artists in the traditional sense who need to be thinking this way. It's everyone, right?
Absolutely. He makes this point that we're all in show business now. Seriously. Yeah. It doesn't matter if you're a baker, a lawyer, a teacher, whatever. You're telling a story. You're building relationships. You're creating an experience. And the really cool thing is that we have more control over that experience than ever before.
We have the power to choose what kind of show we want to put on. He talks about this idea of the picker self, the ability to choose your own path instead of just waiting for someone to pick you.
Yes. And he gives examples like Louis C.K. and Mark Maron, these comedians, who basically said, forget the traditional gatekeepers. We're going to connect directly with our audience. And they did. They built their own platforms, and they found huge success doing it their way. And he even looks at the music industry. Before the internet, the odds of making it big as a musician were astronomically small. You had to get signed by a label, get your music on the radio, it was a whole thing. But now, the power has shifted. Artists can connect with their audience directly without all the middlemen.
So connection isn't just a byproduct of art, it's actually the goal. It's how we measure its impact.
Exactly. He says that the true measure of your work is the connections it creates. Think about a meeting, right? If someone shares an idea that sparks a real conversation that gets people thinking in new ways, that's creating a connection. Or a piece of content online that goes viral because it resonates with people, that's connection too. Yeah, safe and boring, those things don't create connections, they create apathy. Real connection happens when we're being our true, authentic selves.
And to do that, we have to resist that urge to just numb ourselves out, to just go through the motions,
Yes. It's so easy to just kind of check out, to do our jobs, get our paychecks, and not really engage with the world. But that's not where the good stuff happens. He reminds us that art requires generosity, it requires vulnerability, and most importantly, it requires a willingness to take risks, to be okay with the possibility of failure. He says art requires the artist to care, and to care enough to do something when he knows that it might not work.
Okay, so, to break this down even further, What are the essential elements of this art we're talking about? How can we recognize it?
He boils it down to three things. It has to be personal, it has to be untested, and it has to be intended to connect. Personal, because it comes from you, from your unique perspective, from your experiences, from the things you care about. Untested, because it's something new, it's something original, it hasn't been done before. And finally, it has to be intended to connect with others. Art that's just for you, that you keep locked away, that doesn't really count, at least not in Godin's world.
Interesting. And he also makes this distinction between the traditional entrepreneur and what he calls the impresario. What's the difference?
Yeah, so the classic entrepreneur, they're all about disruption. They challenge the established order. They build big businesses. They're driven by, profit and growth. The impresario, on the other hand, they're more about connection. They might not be trying to build a billion-dollar company. They're more interested in creating experiences and bringing people together and making something beautiful happen. They're not necessarily motivated by money. They're motivated by, well, the art itself.
He also throws out these really thought-provoking questions, to get you thinking about how you view the world.
He does. He asks things like, how can I accumulate more versus how can I contribute more value? Or how can I guarantee a successful outcome versus how can I embrace the possibility of failure? Or even, where is the well-defined path versus where is the uncharted territory? It's all about shifting your mindset from scarcity to abundance, from control to possibility.
He even talks about the gods of the new work. Like, what does that even mean?
Well, he contrasts the old work, the industrial work, which was all about, following instructions, being a good little cog in the machine, with this new work, which requires a different kind of mindset. This new work, he says, is suited for mythological gods. People who are proactive, who take ownership, who are comfortable with freedom and responsibility.
It's about stepping into your power. And he talks a lot about the power of myths too, right? Like, what can we learn from those old stories?
He says that myths are more than just stories. They're like blueprints for how to live a more meaningful life. He points to heroes like Helen Keller and Hercules, and he says they're not there to make us feel bad about ourselves. They're there to inspire us, to show us what's possible.
But, there's this idea that you have to be born with talent to be an artist. What does Godin say to that?
He completely rejects that idea. He calls it the myth of talent. He says the talent is way overrated. What really matters is grit, that combination of passion and perseverance, that ability to stick with something even when it's hard.
And he talks about that inner battle we all face, right? Between our potential and our fear.
All the time. On the one hand, we have this amazing potential, this ability to create, to connect, to make a real difference. But on the other hand, there's that voice of fear, that voice that says, you're not good enough, you're going to fail, don't even try. And a lot of that fear comes from those old industrial systems we've been talking about.
So how do we quiet that voice? How do we tip the scales in favor of our potential?
It's a conscious choice. We have to choose to believe in ourselves, to embrace our creativity, to take risks. And he uses this great analogy of Superman and kryptonite. He says that in the industrial world, we're all supposed to be like interchangeable cogs. But art requires vulnerability. It requires us to show up as our true selves with all our flaws and imperfections. And that's scary. It's like exposing our kryptonite.
Yeah, but he also says that true connection, real human connection, that only happens when we're vulnerable, when we let our guard down.
Exactly. Think about the difference between like small talk and a real conversation. When you really connect with someone, when you share something meaningful, when you let them see your true self, that's when the magic happens. And art, good art, it strives for that level of connection.
And he talks about the resistance, this force that tries to stop us from creating, and how it's actually a sign that we're on the right track.
Yeah, the resistance is that voice in your head that says, this is stupid, why are you even trying? You're going to fail. And most people, they try to avoid that feeling at all costs. But Godin says that artists, real artists, they learn to recognize that feeling, to embrace it even, because it means they're pushing boundaries. They're doing something that matters.
So failure isn't something to be afraid of. It's a part of the process.
Exactly. Failure is how we learn, how we grow. It's part of the journey.
He also talks about this obsession with the mass market and how that can be a trap.
He does. We've been conditioned to believe that we have to appeal to everyone, that the bigger the audience, the better. But true art, it often starts small. It resonates with a specific group of people, a niche, and then if it's really good, it spreads from there.
And he brings up James Elkin's framework for becoming an artist. seeing, making, and the tabula rasa. Can you explain what that means?
Sure. Elkin says that to be an artist, you have to learn to see the world differently. Without all those labels and judgments we usually put on things, you have to learn to make, to create, to experiment. And you have to embrace the idea of the tabula rasa, the blank slate. You have to be willing to start fresh, to let go of your preconceived notions, to try something new. He uses Steve Martin as an example. He says that Steve Martin was constantly reinventing himself, always pushing himself to do something different.
But being original doesn't mean you can just, like, ignore everything that's come before you.
No, definitely not. Godin says that having a deep understanding of your field, your domain knowledge, is crucial. He uses Andrew Stanton, the filmmaker, as an example. Stanton was like a genius at animation, but when he tried to make a live-action film, it flopped. He didn't have that same level of expertise in that different domain. So originality is important, but so is knowing your stuff.
So if we're not just measuring success by, how much money we make, how do we know if our art is, like, good? How do we measure its impact?
Godin says that the true measure of your work is the connections it creates. And he gives examples like, a meeting where someone shares an idea that sparks a real discussion, or a piece of content online that goes viral because it resonates with people, or local business that creates a real sense of community. It's about the impact you have on others, the difference you make in the world.
And you can't just, like, systematize art, right? Like trying to turn it into a formula or a factory process that kills the magic.
Exactly. He cautions against trying to, replicate success by turning art into a job. Creativity, it doesn't thrive in that kind of environment.
But we can get better at being artists, right? It's about practice, and he mentions this, cultivating good taste.
Yes. The more we create, the better we get. He quotes Ira Glass, who says that, there's this gap between our taste and our ability when we're starting out. But the more we practice, the more we create, the smaller that gap gets.
And he encourages us to be patrons of the arts, but he's not just talking about donating money.
No, he's talking about supporting the people who are out there doing the work, the people who are taking risks, the people who are trying to make a difference, even when it's hard. It's about recognizing the value of creativity and innovation, even if it doesn't always lead to, mainstream success.
And he talks about the role of the audience in art. He quotes people like Duchamp and Klein. What are they saying?
They're saying that the audience isn't passive. The audience is actually part of the creative process. Art doesn't exist in a vacuum. It needs an audience to complete it, to give it meaning. And sometimes the most important audience is that small group of people who really get it, who connect with your work on a deep level.
And he brings back the lizard brain idea, that part of our brain that's always trying to keep us safe, but that can also hold us back.
Yeah, the amygdala, that's the fear center of our brain. It's always scanning for danger, always trying to keep us in our comfort zone. But to be an artist, to truly create, we have to be willing to step outside of that comfort zone, to face our fears.
And he says something really important. You are not your art. Why is that distinction so crucial?
It's about detaching your ego from your work. It's about being able to take criticism without taking it personally. Because if you believe that your art is a reflection of your worth as a human being, well, then any negative feedback is going to feel like a personal attack. And that's going to make it really hard to keep creating.
He also talks about this idea of consistency and how it's not always a good thing. He even uses Steve Jobs as an example.
Right. We often think of Steve Jobs as this, like, unwavering visionary. But apparently he changed his mind all the time. He wasn't afraid to pivot, to try something new. So it's not about being right all the time. It's about having the courage to follow your convictions, even if it means changing course along the way.
And he introduces this idea of the infinite game of art. What's that about?
He contrasts it with finite games, which have, clear winners and losers, like a football game. But art, he says, is an infinite game. It's not about winning or losing. It's about continuing to play, about getting better, about making a contribution. And the connection economy, it thrives on this infinite game mentality. It's about collaboration. It's about sharing ideas. It's about building something together.
So it's a journey, not a destination. And Godin says that true artists are restless. They embrace new things. They're always looking for the next challenge.
He uses the word neophilia, which means love of the new. Artists, they're curious. They're constantly experimenting. They're never satisfied with the status quo. And he even uses this fun word, galumphing, to describe that playful, almost childlike exploration that artists engage in.
He also has this thing called the Poundstone Shift. What's that about?
The Poundstone Shift is about valuing your true fans, the people who really get you, who connect with your work on a deep level. He says those are the people you should be focusing on, not the masses.
And he talks about box 5, the fear of being seen as a fraud.
Yeah, box 5 is that fear we all have of being exposed, of being found out, of not being good enough. And it can be paralyzing. But he says that the best way to overcome that fear is to just keep creating, to keep putting yourself out there.
He also talks about the shift from a scarcity mindset to an abundance mindset. How does that play out in the connection economy?
The industrial age was all about scarcity. Limited resources, limited opportunities. But the connection economy is based on abundance. Connections create more connections. Trust builds more trust. It's a virtuous cycle. And that abundance mindset, it's essential for creating art and for building meaningful relationships.
And he ends with this powerful call to action, leaping into the void with grace and faith.
That's it. Art requires a leap of faith. It requires us to trust ourselves, to trust our intuition, to trust that even if we fail, we'll be okay.
And a final reminder, just like no one else, be yourself, embrace your uniqueness. That's where the magic happens.
And he ends with a really optimistic message. Never a better time.
Now is the time to embrace your inner artist, to create, to connect, to make a difference. So to wrap up this deep dive into the Icarus Deception, here are the key takeaways. Forget everything you thought you knew about art. It's not about paintbrushes and pianos. It's about being brave, being creative, and connecting with others in a meaningful way. And in this new world, flying too low, playing it safe, that's the real danger. The connection economy rewards artists, people who are willing to take risks, to be vulnerable, to create something new and beautiful and strange. So, my question for you is, where are you playing it too safe? Where are you holding yourself back? What would it look like to embrace your inner artist, to take a leap of faith, to create something that truly matters? Think about it.
I think that's a great place to leave it. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
We'll see you next time.